So Betty White, one of the funniest things that she did was on WWE Raw. One of the wrestlers was interviewing her on the show, and then Big Show asked her, "What are we going to do tonight, Betty?" "I'm going to kick some ass," is what she responded with.
I'm going to kick some ass.
She was a force to be reckoned with, and I'm just curious, because she's now passed away, can I go see Betty White's will?
This is Ask a Lawyer with Blaine Cluton. I am an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. I am going to just go ahead and call this podcast to session. We're going to call this podcast to order. If you have a question, you should submit it on the fairpunishment.org website. To hear a little bit more about that, I've got Andrew McGuire in studio with us today. Andrew.
Hey, Blaine. Good to hear you again. Everybody should be going to fairpunishment.org/questions. Submit your question there. We'll get it in the queue and stack rank it for the next episode that we're going to put together for you.
All right. And Andrew is not an attorney. I am an attorney. This is for general information only. This is not legal advice. It's a good starting point in your journey. If you have questions at the end of all this, which you probably will, please talk to an attorney. All right, so what are we going to be talking about on today's Ask a Lawyer podcast, Andrew?
A very morbid topic, Blaine. Wills and death. We're going to talk about are wills public record? That's the headline, the question. Are wills public record? But in that subtopics, we want to talk about, first of all, what is a will? And then we move into wills in the probate court, talk about whether it's public record or not, the main point of this podcast. And then how do we find a will? And jump into some final thoughts. And I have a story that I want to talk about. But before we get into an example of how this is all relatable back to the layman, which is me, what is a will?
You let off by saying it's a morbid topic. It is once they pass away, but until they do, it's just a bunch of estate planning, which is extremely important for folks to do.
Yeah, true. But it's about death. And yes, you need to plan, but it makes you think. So I'm not going to get into personal stuff on this, but it makes you think about a lot of things when you go through that process. And it is really important, but it also makes you really look at your life. So it is a important topic that everybody should do. And if you haven't, you should.
Well, it's important. I understand what you're saying. I do a lot of estate planning, and what you're talking about is very, very common. I've had folks before where they will hold off on signing a will before they go on a big vacation because they're afraid it's going to jinx their vacation and they're going to pass away on their vacation. It's a very important thing, and it's a very important point in people's life as they're doing this estate planning process. So generally speaking, there's a couple of different ways that we do estate planning, or there's different vehicles for doing estate planning. One is through a will, one is through a trust, and one is through estate planning to avoid probate altogether. And so a will is one of these vehicles. And generally speaking, what a will does is it says who are going to be your beneficiaries and who is going to get what property from your estate. Backing up and broadly speaking, the difference between a will and a trust is a will takes whatever property you have, wherever it's situated, and it devises it or it divvies it up in a specific way. Whereas a trust gathers all of your property while you're living, puts it into the name of a trust, and then defines how that property is going to be divided going forward. So a trust is kind of similar. It's a legal fiction, similar to like an LLC is the closest explanation I can give, where you're putting something into another thing's name. Whereas a will, you don't have to change any ownership structure or anything. It just says wherever I have it, wherever it is, this is how I'm dividing it up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask you is whether trust, estate planning, all of that, a will is literally just, to simplify it down, a piece of paper that says, all right, I have these 5 things. These 4 go to this person. This one goes to someone else. I mean, it could be a person or an entity or another trust or something. But the idea of just writing down, this is everything that I own and this is where it's going to go, right?
Well, and even more than that, or aside from that, you're not defining necessarily what property you have and then dividing up who it goes to. So you won't say necessarily this car goes to this person, this personal property goes to this person, this house goes to this person. What you do instead is you divide it usually in shares or percentages. So for instance, if I have 3 kids, I'll say 1 share each to each child of all of the assets that I have. And then they are to divide the personal property that I have and share that alike is usually the language.
But going back to my point about the personal stuff where you have to get into it and it turns into this morbid thing. Like, what if I have a favorite child and I want to give them 2 shares and another child 1 and none of them 0? You actually have to think about who your favorite kid is, Blaine. Anyway, my point was like that, but I understand what you're saying, right? You split it up, you can have shares, it goes equally, but in general, it's a document that allows you to make decisions on where things go when you die.
And, what you're saying is awful important because, yes, people get written out of wills. People will leave shares or percentages to charity and then potentially be cutting off their children or grandchildren from the will. There are so many different ways to achieve what you're trying to do with estate planning and how you're going to divide up this property that, yes, it is not going to happen until you pass away, but there are also considerations for giving gifts during your lifetime. And how and when you might do that, it's important to talk to either an attorney that specializes in tax law or an accountant to understand what amounts of money you may be giving away during your lifetime to avoid inheritance tax when you pass away.
Okay. Yeah. I think coming back to the original question, what is a will? And then the second part here, moving into wills in the probate court. I honestly don't even know what probate court is. So can you just start with describing what that is?
Sure. So when you pass away or when you die, whatever nomenclature you want to use, the personal representatives or the heirs of your estate are going to take that will and they're going to file it with the court and have generally an executor or personal representative appointed by the court. That person then goes and takes control over your estate. And what they are required to do at that point is take an inventory or take control over all of the assets from your estate and to determine all of your creditors and make sure all those creditors have been paid off. So the probate court, all that means is that is the court that your will is going to be processed through.
Okay.
So that the heirs or the people that are receiving under the will receive after that those claims are processed through the court.
Okay. Here's my story. I think that would be relevant for this next topic, which is public record or not. So what about all the people in the past where I could go look this up? So one person that recently passed away was on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2021. And this person we all know pretty well. So Betty White. And I'm assuming she had a will and probably an estate and a trust like you were saying before. But some of the things that I remember from her, Toy Story 4, SpongeBob SquarePants, and then one of the funniest things that she did, at least from my perspective, she was on WWE Raw, and she was at the time on Off Their Rockers, the show. And Big Show, one of the wrestlers, was interviewing her on the show, and she said, "I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be a guest on Monday Night Raw." And then Big Show asked her, "What are we going to do tonight, Betty?" "I'm going to kick some ass," is what she responded with. So she was a force to be reckoned with. And I'm just curious if, because she's now passed away and we're talking about public record, can I go see Betty White's will?
My Betty White story is that at the end of law school and before I took the bar exam, I had never really watched Golden Girls that much before. But my then girlfriend, now wife, Nicole, she was like, we got to do something during bar prep to take our minds off bar preparation. So we're going to watch some Golden Girls because it's popcorn kind of stuff. So we put it on. It was fairly evident quickly why that show was so good. And Betty White was one of the main reasons.
So I recently heard about the show called Friends. And yes, you would think I've watched it before, but no. I'm in the middle of season 4 watching Friends episodes. So it sounds like now this is the next thing I need to do is go back in time to Betty White.
Oh, yeah.
After I get through Friends. But people are making fun of me with, what do you mean you haven't seen Friends?
So generally, wills are not public record. So the way that they become public record is that they get filed with the court, and court files are public record. So assuming that her will gets filed with the probate court in whatever state she's in Florida, California, wherever her primary residence was or wherever she was living, once she actually has that will filed with the probate court, then it would become public record. But most likely, Betty White had a trust. And trust documents generally are not filed with the court unless there's a piece of property that did not get included into the trust, and they have to file the pour-over will with the court in order to probate out a piece of property that was not properly placed into the trust. Yeah, and a pour-over will is a catch-all provision that we include when we're doing trusts, and it literally takes that piece of property and pours it back into the trust. So when you're creating a trust, you have to rename real property into the name of the trust. So if I have a piece of real property in Iowa and it's a farm, then I would call it the Blaine Cluton Family Trust. If I go and buy another parcel of property and I forgot to put it into the Blaine Cluton Family Trust and it's just held by Blaine Cluton, then the pour-over will is going to capture that piece of property and pour it back into the trust. But it does have to be probated.
Okay. Wills are not public record because...
Not until they're filed with the court, correct.
Right. And typically with, like, if I wanted to go find any famous actor or actress, since we're talking about Betty White, most likely they had a trust and that's not going to be filed with the court because it's in a trust.
And I mean, to go on to your next question about searching for wills, it's a real problem. So when people create wills with me, the thing that I tell them to do, I usually tell them a couple of things. First of all, I usually tell them, don't share the contents of your will or a copy of your will with other people because it usually leads to jealousy, breeds contempt. So keep a copy of your will in a safe place, usually a fireproof safe. Let people know where the will is so they can find it when you pass away. If nobody can find your will, then your will may not be done. So if they can't find your will, then you may at some point be presumed to have died intestate, meaning without a will, and they're going to follow the rules of intestate succession for whatever state you're in. And the heirs then would receive according to the statutory rules in your state.
This sounds like a business opportunity, Blaine, where you can go find a way of organizing everyone's will that exists. And when it's done, it goes into this digital portal that's secure. And this is where we go to look up someone's will based on social security number or some unique ID and be able to see that it is done. It's just that I didn't want to share it and I lost it. Or with all these crazy fires out west, what if it burned down and I didn't have a fireproof safe? And now the only copy was in the house that burned down in California fire. It sounds like an opportunity to actually figure out how to solve this problem for someone in our audience.
I think that somebody might be able to do it. The problem is that there's all these pesky confidentiality rules that attorneys have. And even storing documents electronically yourself. So me as an attorney, if I'm electronically storing documents, I have to follow very strict protocols for how those are managed. Because if they're accessed and my system is breached, then I can potentially have a confidentiality issue. So there are quite a few issues surrounding confidentiality and privilege around those documents.
All right. Well, what we talked about today, what is a will? Wills in the probate court, whether it's public record or not. And the short answer is no. And how do we find a will, which is also a problem. So what are your final thoughts on all this and what the people should know around wills and in the public record here?
You should do estate planning. The worst thing that you can do is pass away and have your loved ones not know how you wanted to divide your property up. Whether that's a will, it's a trust, or you can do estate planning that avoids probate altogether. You should be talking to an attorney about how to do all these things. A dangerous way, in my opinion, for doing this kind of stuff is these do-it-yourself forms online. They're very easy to get screwed up, and you may not actually be dividing the property up in the way that you wanted it to be. You may be making a mistake. So talk to an attorney and do this will preparation in advance of you passing away. Don't let a moment go by without getting this done.
All right. Thank you, sir. Good words.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me, Andrew.
Yeah, absolutely.
This has been Ask a Lawyer. If you have questions, please submit them at our website. Andrew, can you tell them where to go?
fairpunishment.org/questions.
All right. So this has been Ask a Lawyer with Blaine Cluton for Andrew McGuire. Until we see you next time, I'm calling podcast adjourned.